Today I want to continue my little series of videos here where I try to answer a lot of the questions regarding 1911s that I've started receiving ever since I announced that I am switching over to a 1911 for carry due to, getting old. I think it's a requirement that once you get to a certain age, you have to officially retire from life in general, basically. And part of that is carrying a 45 ACP 1911. And today I want to talk about what is probably the most hotly debated topic in the 1911 community. Other than whether straw hats go with suspenders, and that is the Series 70 1911s versus Series 80 1911s, and which is better. This has been a topic of great discussion in the 1911 community, a great dispute. So today I'm going to use my authority as a self-proclaimed internet gun expert to answer that question once and for all. And that answer is, well, neither of them really. Neither one of them is better than the other. They both have their positives and their negatives, but even the positives and negatives are very small. They're a very small difference between the two guns. Both function fine. This idea that one is more reliable than the other is just bupkis. It's not really true, and I'm going to show you here why that's not really true. I'm going to go over the differences between the Series 70 and the Series 80 here, and you're going to see that this argument over which is better has actually been much ado about nothing. Now I'm going to use my Series 70 Smith & Wesson 1911 and my Series 80 Colt 1911 here, and some graphics that I threw together to illustrate the difference between the two and show you how minor they really are. When you get right down to it, the difference between the two guns is three little mechanical parts, two levers and a plunger. And if you count the spring above the plunger, that'd be 4 parts, but I couldn't figure out how to animate a spring, so we're going to leave that out and just stick to the 3 actual mechanical parts. These 3 little parts work together to create a firing pin block, or a drop safety for the gun. That's the biggest difference. One has a drop safety, a firing pin block, and one doesn't. The Series 80s have them, the Series 70s don't. Now, if you look at the slide on the Series 80, you'll see the little plunger I was talking about right there. It's got a little spring above it. The spring pushes it back down after you push up on it, and it's held in place by the firing pin. And here on the frame, you will actually see the little top lever. You can't see the bottom one because it's down in the gun, but you can see the top lever right there. And if you can see, when I pull the trigger, it pops up, and that pushes the little plunger up. If you look at the slide on the Series 70, well, there's no plunger there. And if you look at the frame, there's no little lever there either. Now, some people will like to argue that, yeah, but that little system in the Series 80s makes it less reliable because it's more parts that can fail. And that's just bupkis. This is such a simple system in such a controlled environment that there's almost no points of possible failure. There's just no way this system can really go bad. It's a very simple mechanism in a very controlled environment. It's completely sandwiched in. There's almost nothing that can go wrong. It's so simple. In fact, let's look at how it works here. Now, first you have to look at one other difference between these two guns to know how this system works, and that's the firing pin. You can see the Series 70 firing pin on top and the Series 80 firing pin on the bottom, and you notice the Series 80 firing pin has that divot in it, that little rounded out part, that little gully that goes all the way around it. That little machined out area is so the plunger can sit next to it and hold the firing pin in place. If that plunger is in place, the firing pin cannot move forward. And that little spring above the plunger that we talked about earlier holds it down in place. Now, the way that little firing pin block works is those other 2 little levers in conjunction with the trigger work to move it out of the way so the firing pin can function. When you push the trigger to the rear, it forces both of those little levers upward. The upward arm on both levers goes upward. The top lever pushes up on the plunger against the spring, clearing the firing pin. That narrow area in the plunger hits up with the narrow area in the firing pin, and that allows the firing pin to move past. Now, after the gun is cycled and you release the trigger, that little spring pushes the plunger back down, which resets the 2 little levers below it. And that process just happens again and again and again while you're firing. That mechanism is just so simple. As you can see, there's just very little ways that system could actually fail. The only way it could actually really fail is complete mechanical failure of a part, which isn't very likely to happen since they're just simple metal pieces, or the spring could malfunction in the plunger and not reset the plunger. And in that case, the gun would still fire, it just wouldn't have a firing pin safety anymore. The drop safety would not be functioning. So when you look at the advantages and disadvantages of the two guns, the only real advantage to the Series 80 is you have a drop safety. So in states that require drop safeties, you can have a 1911 in them. The only real disadvantage is when you're putting the gun back together, those little pieces can be a pain in the butt, and you can put them in wrong. If you put them in wrong, well, you'll probably know, because usually when you put them in wrong, your gun won't go back together right and it won't recycle, or you can't put your magazine in. I've actually put the part in so wrong before that I couldn't get the magazine in, then I realized, oh crap, the piece is in almost backwards. So that's really the only disadvantage, is it's a little bit harder when you detail strip the gun and put it back together. That whole idea that there's more moving parts so it's less reliable is just bunk. Moving parts don't make a gun unreliable as long as they're not complex or prone to failure. I think most people are aware that Swiss watches exist and they have tons of moving parts and they're extremely reliable. So to pretend like a gun can't have a few parts in it and be reliable is kind of ridiculous. I've even had some people in the past that don't like Series 80s send me a link to an article they read once that was actually a post from a representative from one of the 1911 manufacturers on a forum where they said the Series 80 design was to decrease reliability in the pistol. And I had to go back and point out to them that that word was not reliability, that word was liability. They were decreasing legal liability for accidents that occurred with the pistol. It had nothing to do with reliability. That's just a perfect example of how people can take one word that they read wrong and use that to demonize something. And then when you look at the Series 70, the advantages and disadvantages, the pros and cons are pretty much just the opposite. The pros are you don't have those extra little pieces to put back together. So it's easier to disassemble and assemble. The con is you don't have a firing pin block. You don't really have a drop safety. Now, you can usually make a gun drop safe by using the right weight firing pin spring, but it's still not as reliable as an actual drop safety. And in some states, it's required to have a drop safety to pass the tests, so some guns need to have them. So small pluses and minuses for both of them. Now, one other thing a lot of people will try to say is a difference between the Series 80s and the Series 70s is trigger pull. And I don't agree with them at all. They'll say that the Series 80s trigger has to be longer and it's rougher simply because it has to move that mechanism. But I don't agree with that at all, because if you'll look here at this trigger, let's watch the movement of this trigger here in this gun. This is the Series 70. You got a little bit of take up here, just a little bit, and then you've got just a little bit of movement for the break. Now, if we look at the Series 80 gun, just a little bit of movement here, and then just a little bit of movement for the break. The distance in travel is nothing you would ever notice. And as far as the resistance, the only resistance in that mechanism is that tiny little spring at the top of the plunger. You're not going to feel that. So when it comes to trigger, which one has a better trigger? It just depends on the manufacturer and how much effort they put into making the trigger good. As far as shooting them, carrying them, and everything else, you're never going to notice. If you don't disassemble the gun, if you don't actually detail strip the gun, you could carry both of these for 10 years and never notice a difference between a Series 70 and a Series 80. So the Series 80 pistols are just one thing. They're a solution to a problem that exists in some states, and they're a solution to a problem that some people wanted solved because some people like to have a drop safety in their firearm. And for people who don't face those issues, well, it's either Series 70 or Series 80 would be great for you. But if you're someone that doesn't want a drop safety in your gun and doesn't want to have to reassemble those little pieces all the time, well, then the Series 70 would be for you. So it's all personal preference. Like I said, if you can carry a gun for 5 years and shoot it every day and never notice a difference, then that difference doesn't really matter. So choose whichever one you think is best for you.